Good afternoon, and thanks very much for that introduction. I'm sorry to hear it hasn't been an easy experience for lots of you, but I'm hoping today to dispel some of the myths about planning, because actually having sat through a session on succession with all the tax and finance and complexities, this is really easy, honest. Today I'm going to, hold on. Do I need to point this at something? There we go. Okay, so today I'm going to just answer some simple questions really about how the planning system works as a whole, just the basics of what makes the planning system work, and cover also who's responsible for what, so to give you an idea of who to approach for different questions about planning. Then the million-dollar question about what might or might not get planning permission, well, I will cover that, but I will talk in terms of the national planning framework and the policy framework that we have that might be relevant to you. I can't give advice on individual cases, I'm very sorry, but I'll hopefully give you an idea of the things that planning does support, because it really is about enabling, not regulating. It's about making things happen. And also I'll touch at the end, people always like to hear about what they can do without having to go through the planning system. I don't know why that is, but I will touch on that at the end. So, all you'd really need to know about planning is that it's a plan-led system. So this slide here sets out the different parts of the plan-led system. And the legal basis for all decisions about planning applications is the Statutory Development Plan. And in Scotland, that comprises the National Planning Framework, which was prepared by the Scottish Government and adopted by ministers, as well as the Local Development Plan, which is prepared by local authorities, or planning authorities, which includes the 2 national parks. There's also regional spatial strategies, which is a new thing in the system that we'll be bringing forward next year, and local place plans. And they sit outside the Statutory Development Plan, but have a really important influence in the different parts of the plan. So if you need to know anything, if you do something that is in accordance with the development plan, you should get planning permission. If it's separate, if it's not allocated, or it's not supported by policies in the plan, it's a whole load more difficult. So in terms of responsibilities for planning in Scotland, so the Scottish Government has quite significant powers in the system. So we have 2 parts. So there's the Division for Planning and Environmental Appeals, and they deal with appeals, surprisingly enough. So they have independently appointed reporters who act on behalf of Scottish ministers to determine appeals. So if something is refused and it goes to appeal, then the reporters will deal with that. We also have my team in the Scottish Government Planning, Architecture and Regeneration Division, and we deal with legislation, we deal with national planning policy. We sometimes provide advice to ministers on called-in applications, so those are quite significant, nationally significant applications that ministers decide to determine themselves, and also recalled applications, so where an appeal is being determined by a reporter, sometimes ministers will decide they want to decide it rather than the reporter. So far so good. Hopefully this is all really clear. Then we have planning authorities. So they really are the first point of contact and the main people you will deal with in the planning system. And they have responsibility for local development plans and planning applications in the first instance. So most are decided by planning authorities. Most of those applications are determined by officers rather than by locally elected members. But the committees do make some decisions and some go to full council, depending on which council you are. I would say 94.5% of planning applications in Scotland are approved. So that's a little known fact, but quite an important fact. So it's not as bad as you think, honest. Local authorities also have local review bodies, and they decide appeals. So if an officer has made a decision, sometimes it can be appealed and go to a small group of councillors. They have lots of other duties, so they're very busy planning departments, and we are working with them to improve the resourcing of the planning system at the moment, so they have lots of other things to do. This is just a few examples. So they keep a register of local place plans that are prepared by communities in their area. They also keep a register of people that are interested in self-build, and they will have responsibilities for preparing regional spatial strategies. So that's just a few examples. So one of the main messages I wanted to give you today is that we have a new national planning framework, so National Planning Framework 4, and it was adopted earlier this year. And it really is quite a significant change to the planning system in Scotland. And the main drivers for this really are the climate and nature emergency. So it's got a very strong story around sustainable development. And I know you've been hearing quite a lot about that earlier today. So this is about making the right decisions for us now, but also for future generations, and making sure that it's through a sustainability lens that we're considering things. National Planning Framework 4 is not just something that the Scottish Government has prepared, has sat in our ivory tower and prepared on our own. It has been a real product of collaboration, and we've had really good input from across Scotland. And planning can often be controversial, but I think it's fair to say there was really strong buy-in to what we're trying to achieve with NPF 4. It went through the parliamentary process, so Parliament considered it for 120 days and had a lot of debate about it, and it was adopted by ministers only after the Parliament as a whole had approved it. So what is it? It sets out a long-term vision for Scotland, a long-term spatial strategy. So the question of our geography and different parts of Scotland and how they can contribute to our vision for the future. It sets out national planning policies, so 33 national planning policies that are there to be applied to individual decisions. And it's also supported by a delivery programme which forms a basis for the work of my team really, and we're working on how we support delivery of that vision in practice. As I mentioned before, it's part of the Statutory Development Plan. So this is the first time NPF 4 has been more than just a document that's nice to read and look at. It's something that is really applied to decision making. So it's a very good starting point for understanding what would or wouldn't be supported by the planning system. But importantly, it works together with local development plans for each area. So when you're applying policies, you apply the policies in the NPF as well as those that are being adopted locally. So this slide really in a nutshell summarises the overall approach of NPF 4, and it sets out a vision for Scotland in 2045, which is about making Scotland a sustainable place, so somewhere where the environment is an asset and recognised, but part of our future and part of our economy. Livable places, so a people-centred approach, so thinking about how planning can help people to live well. And productive places, so planning has a really important role to play in supporting economic development and a well-being economy and in community wealth building, so all of that is part of our vision. And these smaller titles here are spatial principles that guide what we want to achieve. So a just transition, so although it's about climate change, we want to make sure it's a just transition and no one's left behind in that transition to net zero. It's about conserving and recycling our assets, so making best use of our land and our buildings. Under livable places, local living is a key part of this. So some people talk about 20-minute neighbourhoods. It's a bit broader than that, really. It's about living well locally. And compact urban growth. So to some extent, we want to make sure we make very wise use of our land and avoid endless sort of urban expansion. And under productive places, the spatial principles are about balancing development, so directing development where it's most needed and managing it in areas of pressure, but also critically for you, rural revitalisation. So this was a key principle that was introduced actually by the Scottish Parliament, who were very keen to see that the National Planning Framework and the planning system as a whole contributes to repopulating rural Scotland. So there's a very strong enabling and positive approach to rural development throughout the strategy as a whole. So this slide here summarises our big vision for Scotland in the future. And again, this might feel quite a long way from your individual businesses, but I think it's really important to set the context for the more detailed policies. And it shows that different parts of Scotland will have a different role in supporting a sustainable future. So in the north and west, there's an emphasis on the blue and green economy and growing communities through opportunities for sustainable development in those areas. In the north of the country, again, it's about the green economy, but it's also about helping to improve and to grow communities and taking advantage of the many opportunities that will come from the low carbon agenda. In the northeast of Scotland, we're trying to encourage a transition away from a reliance on oil and gas towards a more sustainable future and using the expertise in that part of the country to help us to get to net zero. In the south of the country, again, like the north, it's about the green economy and it's about sustainable rural living. So we've explored in the National Planning Framework what that will look like in the future. And then across the Central Belt, there's much more of an emphasis on urban areas and how we can achieve low carbon urban living. So these are the critical policies that are set out in the National Planning Framework. And again, they're grouped under the 3 key themes of sustainable, livable and productive places. And you'll see policy 1 here cuts across all of the policies, and it's about tackling the nature and climate crisis. So basically it means that all decisions have to take into account what the impact will be on climate change and on biodiversity and nature. And there's strong policy there expecting enhancement of nature as well as protection. Under sustainable places, there's a range of more detailed policies that cover different environmental assets, but also types of development like renewable energy and zero waste. Under livable places, that's about the places where people live, unsurprisingly, so local living, but also housing, quality homes, rural homes, infrastructure, and to support all of that, blue and green infrastructure, flood risk, health and safety. So the places where people live are an important part of the system. And then under productive places, the policies focus on different types of development or different locations, and it's more of an economic development agenda. So just emphasising again, policy 1 on its own has quite a big influence, but all of these policies have to be read and applied as a whole, as we say in the world of planning. So that means if you've got a planning application, no one policy will determine whether or not it will be approved or refused. They have to be taken together, and the relevant policies are applied in each case. This is just highlighting one of the key policies that might be of interest to you, so the Rural Homes Policy 17 in the National Planning Framework. So this was actually drawn out as a separate policy based on the responses we got to the consultation because we'd had one section on housing, but we felt it was really important to emphasise the importance of homes for rural areas. So Policy 17A, there's a big long list here of different types of proposals for housing that are supported, whether that's on allocated sites, on brownfield sites, supporting rural businesses, supporting homes for succession, subdivision, so a whole range of different circumstances. As I say, that policy can't be applied on its own, it has to be applied together with the other policies. And policy 17C here also emphasises that housing will be supported particularly in areas where there's fragile rural communities, to emphasise the role that that has to play in supporting more sustainable rural communities. This policy 29 on rural development in the National Planning Framework also emphasises the importance of rural economic development within that sustainable context. So there's a whole range of land use businesses that are supported in principle, and you can see the list there, so a range of different things that the planning system is there to support you and enable. And like the rural housing policy, there's 29C, which has an even more enabling policy for the more remote rural areas. So again, that has to be applied together with the local development plan for your area, so that will have more detail, but the two should work together. And this is policy on tourism, policy 30. So again, a range of different things are covered by this policy. So there's policy 30A that looks at tourist facilities, particularly supporting that where it's supported by the local development plan. 30B talks about the impacts of tourism to take into account. 30C looks at what happens when there's a proposal to change an existing tourism-related facility. 30D is our policy on huts, and 30E on short-term lets. So again, all of that is included as part of this single policy on tourism, and it's to be read with the other policies in the MPF. So these, I've just put in bold here some of the wider policies that will also be relevant. So it's easy to sort of cherry pick some of the key parts from the document, but it's important to remember there's a much bigger picture here, and many of these other policies are likely to be relevant if you've got a planning application, whether that's on design and quality in place, or it just depends on the location and the circumstances, and that's where your planning authority will decide. It's for the decision maker in each case to decide which policies are relevant. I want to just touch briefly then, so that's the national planning framework, but it's one part of the statutory development plan. The other part is local development plans, and in Scotland we're introducing a completely new system of local development plans as a result of legislation back in 2019. And we published and adopted regulations and guidance earlier this year, shortly after NPF 4 was adopted, that sets out a new process for preparing local development plans and also provides a lot of guidance on what they should contain. And this really emphasises, again, it's a plan-led approach. And if there's one thing I could say to you is engage early and get involved in your local development plan. I know you're all really busy people, and it might not be the first thing you think of when you finish work at night to go and think about your local development plan, but it really does set the framework against which decisions will be made in the future. So to be able to highlight as early as possible to planning authorities that you've got proposals for your land or that you've got ideas about your local place is a really good move. So there'll be new steps to go through in the process of preparing local development plans. There'll be an evidence report prepared, firstly, that sets out all of the information that the planning authority has gathered about the place that will inform a gate check undertaken by independent reporters to check that there's enough information there to then proceed with preparing the plan. There's then a proposed plan, which is consulted on, and that's a real opportunity to have your say in how your local area should evolve in the future. And then another independent examination at the end of that process. So it can take a few years to get through the process of preparing a local development plan, but it's well worth getting engaged when you can. Our aim is for the planning system to be streamlined because we've got these policies in the National Planning Framework. We feel that there's less need then for the local development plans to have all of their own policies or to repeat those national policies. So over time, we expect that there'll be a sort of cleaner landscape of policy and more predictability in the system. So there'll be fewer policies in each local development plan, and each plan will be more map-based, and you'll be able to see from the maps what is proposed in the local area. It'll be very much about the place rather than a set of rules. So this is quite an important time because most local authorities, or many of them anyway, are now working on bringing forward new local development plans for their areas. And they publish a development plan scheme which sets out the process they're going to go through, how they're going to engage with people, and the timelines for that. So it's well worth having a look at that. I promised you to cover, if that isn't attractive enough for you, and reassured you that planning is actually quite a straightforward process. This slide sets out some of the circumstances where you don't necessarily need to go for planning permission through permitted development rights. And over the last few years, we've been working on extending these to give more flexibility in a range of different circumstances. And they're designed to cover less controversial, smaller developments, things that would normally just be be approved through the process. So these classes here we reviewed back in 2021, and there's been extensions of class 18. So that means that basically there's some types of activity you can do, including changing use of agricultural buildings to form dwellings, up to 5 on a farm. Class 18C also allows change of use of agricultural buildings for commercial uses. But there's a lot of small print under this, so it's not universal, and some areas are more restricted than others, so please take this with a pinch of salt. We also extended permitted development rights for peatland restoration at the same time. We did a further review, phase 2, and we've introduced further PDR, including for town centre uses and electric vehicle charging. And we've consulted on a third phase of that, and that is quite extensive proposals for permitted development rights for renewable energy technologies, covering a whole range of different things from wind energy to air source heat pumps. So we're looking to finalise that in early next year. There's also temporary uses of land that are allowed, and I'm sure you're probably aware of that as well. But just to double underline, there are more detailed conditions under all of this, so please check with your planning authority. Don't take my word for it. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a view of, an overview of the planning system. You got a feel for the changes that we've introduced to planning in Scotland, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thanks, Fiona. That's great. Okay, so just to remind everybody, I'll try and navigate questions on the Slido app. We've got our code back up there if you want to log them. Have we got anything burning from the floor which anyone wants to pop through? Okay, so we've got the gentleman with the stripy jumper, second table back. Keep your hand up just now. If you wouldn't mind standing up to ask your question. Just helps us see. We're a bit lower this year. I think the floor's higher, I'm not quite sure.
Hi, so first off, just thank you very much for coming today. We really appreciate that. The Scottish Government is really starting to get behind agritourism, but I would probably say that a lot of people here are finding that that's not getting dealt down to the local planning authorities. Us personally, thank you. So my name's Simon. I come from an alpaca farm in Fife, and we've been on an 8-year back and forth trying to build one house, while around us we see agricultural land sold off for development, or forestry stuff sold off. What we kind of want to know is, what are you going to do to ensure that local authorities understand and get behind agritourism, and that is consistent across all planning authorities, so that we can stop the postcode lottery that seems to come with the planning application?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. Did you catch that?
Okay, right. So, I would say we've set out really strong policy in the National Planning Framework, so we've been clear about what we expect. But the difference is that the National Planning Framework is now part of the Statutory Development Plan. So that sounds like a really nerdy thing to say, but it's really, really important, because it will influence decisions that are made on the ground. We do work closely with all of the heads of planning from all of the local authorities and the 2 national parks, and we're very aware that policies are applied in different ways, and that there's different policies in different areas. Now, part of that is right. It's a local democratic process, and planning authorities should be making decisions. But I think there's a real recognition of the opportunity we have to streamline the process by applying National Planning Framework for policies in a more consistent way, and reducing the policies that we have locally, so that there isn't such a difference between areas. But that will take some time to feed through into the system. Local development plans aren't prepared overnight, so that is a process that we're going through. In the meantime, we are monitoring quite closely how our policies in the National Planning Framework have been applied, and each policy has quite a clear intent set out, which aims to help people interpret it in the way that it was intended. So it has an important role to play in the process. So I acknowledge that it is different in different areas, and that is partly a result of, the nature of the planning system is about local democracy. But at the same time, we are making a move towards a simpler, more consistent approach.
Thanks for that, Fiona. It might just also be worth pointing out, at that strategy board that I represent the membership on, we have been doing a lot of work in trying to kind of highlight some of those inconsistencies and some of those challenges that have been getting fed in by members to the frustrations that are there. And one of the things I know we're exploring is whether is there a sort of regular meeting with the local authority planning sort of chiefs about whether there's a way that there could be a small input just around agritourism as a sector, what its objectives are, what's motivating us, that we might be able to make to some kind of forum in front of that representation from all local authorities. So I know that's something that we've been exploring at that kind of board level to see if we can help spread the word, if you like, from the top down as well as the bottom up. Brilliant, we've got quite a few questions, so we'll bash on with these ones here. There's some commonalities here about the time it takes in terms of the speed of applications. Obviously, a number of people are feeling delays. There's one here in particular. Quite often when we're looking for grants, they're time limited in terms of applying and drawing down. Quite often they're curtailed by the planning process. Someone here's lost £180,000 of potential income to their business through grants that were available that they've lost because the planning process has taken so long. Is there anything that can be done? Can applicants themselves, what's the best way for applicants to speed up that planning process as far as they can control it?
Yeah. Okay, so being in accordance with the development plan is the good first step, because those applications tend to go through in a much more straightforward way. Providing information, so we have looked at the reasons for delays to planning applications, and quite often it is as much as sometimes about the local authority, but it's also sometimes about the information that they've got, and there's always quite a lot toing and froing about the information that's required to support different applications. So that is an important part of the process. If there's a Section 75 planning obligation attached to it, that can significantly add time as well to it. But again, these are things that we're looking at. So we are hearing from planning authorities there are resourcing problems in the planning system, and we're working quite hard with them to think about how we can address them. Now, there isn't a magic pot of money that we can suddenly put into it, because it's not as simple as that. What we're finding is there's not enough planners in Scotland. In fact, in the whole of the UK, there's not enough planners. So we're doing a lot of work to try to improve the resourcing of the system. And we're working with a whole range of partners, because it's not just about the public sector, it's also about industry and the different people that we deal with, to see how we can work together to make things go more smoothly. But yeah, I'm conscious that different applications can take different lengths of time. We do monitor timescales as well, and each planning authority produces a performance report each year, so we do look at that.
Alex here was saying there are statutory timescales, aren't there, for planning, and one of the things that we're trying to work towards is a bit of a member's guide to those timescales that set out really quickly when does the clock start ticking, what's your recourse if it then doesn't hit certain targets, and what is the process for moving that on, because sometimes that's quite hard to really understand, I think, as an applicant. So I'm right in that, I think, Caroline, Emma, that we're hoping to produce that planning guide on some of those critical timescales that will just help you understand at what point you can then start going back and knocking on the door.
If I can add that speaking early to your planning authority is probably the best advice I can give. Talk to them. Yeah. If they know what's coming, they can give you advice before you get to the application stage. It's much smoother.
Any other questions from the floor? We've got a lady down at the front who had your hand up the first time. We've got a microphone down to the front, please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Alice Sinclair from Dunstan Farms in Perthshire. We recently had a planning application for a small holiday bothy refused on the basis that it wasn't near a train station or a bus stop under the NPF4 policy, despite the fact it hit all the other policies. Doesn't that kind of policy just discriminate against rural communities, of which I'm sure 90% of us here are?
And I don't think you're the only one, Alison, in this room who's had the bus stop question raised on a planning application.
Okay, so I can't talk about individual cases, just to be clear, I'm not talking about your case. I'm sorry to hear that. But I would say that if you look at the national planning policy set out in NPF4, it does provide more flexibility in rural circumstances for transport considerations. So we're trying to push really hard sustainability and trying to really emphasise the need to move away from reliance on the car, but we recognise the importance of the car in rural areas. So that is embedded in the policy.
Interesting one here about the relationship between local authority or your national approach to your climate and nature strategies, and how we build in that recognition of the diversity that often farms have. I mean, do we need to be very specific, I suppose? How best do we represent our own individual sort of pockets of nature? I mean, should we be trying to, as farmers, load into our applications details around that diversity and set up within our farms, or is it only taking account of that overarching national sort of policies around climate and nature? Is it helpful to add that?
Absolutely, yeah. So we're talking about changing the world one decision at a time in planning at the moment, and each individual application contributes to what we're trying to achieve nationally. There's a biodiversity policy 3 in MPF, and it sets out quite strong requirements around biodiversity enhancement as well as mitigating the impacts of development. So each application will be viewed in relation to that policy. So yeah, very much so.
There's a question here picking up, I think, on the tourism. Why does tourism development in the countryside get permission so much more easily than housing, which is the bedrock of rural revitalisation?
So I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, but so I mean, all I can say is that we are hearing a lot about the importance of rural housing, and we're hearing about the big opportunities there are in rural Scotland at the moment, and the need for housing to support that. So I think that is really strongly embedded in policy, and having a separate policy on rural housing is probably helpful. We actually, the Minister and I wrote to planning authorities last week, actually emphasising some of the policies, how they're playing out on the ground, and emphasising the importance of an enabling policy for rural housing. So
I don't think this is just a Scottish issue either, but I know when you were in the workshop before talking about succession, what motivates a lot of our members is the fact that we are family businesses, and we're trying to find a way to incorporate and encourage and sustain or grow the business to allow, you know, that family structure to continue. And ultimately, someone once said, if you live close enough to your mother to see her undies on the washing line, you're probably too close, but likewise you don't want to be too far away either. So if we make all this capacity for people to kind of live and work on the farms, they do need somewhere to live. But I know our speaker from Tuscany later, when we were just there in October, his son, if I'm right, can't live on the farm because they're in a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and he has to travel from another village to work every day on the family farm. So it's not just a Scottish issue, I don't think, that one. I think we'd had another hand earlier from the floor up at the back there on the right-hand corner, and then we've probably got time. Am I over time, Caroline? I know we started a bit late, I am, so we'll take, maybe one more question and then we'll wrap.
Indeed, Dr. Simpson, it's very, very welcome that you're here this afternoon. I'm Fiona Campbell. I'm a Director of Scottish Agritourism and Chief Executive of the Association of Scotland Self-Caterers. I just wonder how you consider MPF4 supports Scottish agritourism, particularly in light of policies 17E, F and 30E, because contrary to your brilliant statement earlier that planning should be about enabling, not regulating. Those policies actually seem completely contradictory to that aspiration.
Did you catch that, Fiona?
I caught some of it. So, yeah, no, I mean, I think, so it is about enabling. So we are trying to make sure that the policies are supportive of development, but there have to be policies within the system that recognise the need for protection as well, and it's about a balanced judgment in every case. So we are setting out a clear vision for the future, and it's based on sustainable development, and the policies do set out a range of criteria, and those criteria are there for good reason. But it is, we think it's a big step forward in the national planning framework, and there's a strong narrative around the future that we want to see backed up by policies. Each decision, though, will have to be made on its own merits, and the different policies work together in different ways in different circumstances. So, yeah.
Brilliant. I appreciate there's a lot of questions on Slido that we haven't managed to cover. I will get in trouble if I don't wrap it up, though. What I would say is that Fiona's contact email is chief.planner@gov.scot. I did ask her for permission to circulate that. Clearly, she said she's not in a position to deal with individual inquiries, but I hope that's been useful. If we haven't been able to get to your question today, and it's something that you do want to highlight to Fiona, or you would like to ask to get some feedback, that is the email to use. I'm sure she's around over tea and coffee next, so do please take the chance to go and say hello. Really appreciate your engagement with that. A couple of points as we move on. If you are on the core community group, or will be joining the core community group for the next round of Monitor Farmers, please could you make your way to the outside door of the building where we need to take a photograph of you. You should have had an email to let you know if you're on that group. If you're not sure whether you're on that group or not, you can go and just check in with Caroline quickly, but she would really appreciate that. Everyone else, you're on a tea and coffee break until we meet for our last session of the day. So huge thanks for Fiona here for joining us today.